Welcome to The Digital Footprint, a podcast for leaders in healthcare, public health, and education who are looking to leverage technology to solve problems and make a big impact. In each episode, we interview innovators and entrepreneurs who are solving the most challenging problems facing these industries. Join us as we dig into the colossal tasks involved in bringing a new digital product to life. Welcome to The Digital Footprint.
Hello, and welcome to The Digital Footprint. I'm Richard Sims. This podcast is brought to you by Tyrannosaurus Tech, an award-winning technology partner dedicated to designing and developing high-impact software products. So this is actually episode 4. Wow. We're flying through this podcast. We're having a lot of fun with it. And we have a really good guest today, Matt Cox, CEO of Greenlink Analytics. Matt, we're really excited to have you on the show.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. More than happy to be here.
Awesome. Well, yeah, I've been looking forward to this. And it's funny, we got to know your team over the last few years because we actually work out of the same office building here in Atlanta. And obviously have really liked your team and all of our interactions. And then, of course, the way it works out is we begin actually working with you all in March of 2020. So all of our opportunities to collaborate, face to face went out the window pretty quick, but we've made it work. We've had a lot of fun working with you all, even remotely. And again, it's the great irony. We had never really had any clients truly in the building, and now we have 2 clients in this small building, but can't meet any of them face to face. So you never know what you're going to get. But all right, cool. So let's jump into the actual interview. So first, just to kind of lay some groundwork here, Matt, do you mind just taking a minute or two to introduce yourself and tell the listeners a little bit about Greenlink Analytics?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Matt Cox. I'm the CEO and founder of Greenlink Analytics. We're a 501c3 that's based in Atlanta. We focus on clean energy and equity transitions. So trying to push ourselves towards a clean energy transition as fast and fair as possible is our primary focus. We work mostly in the United States at the city and the state level. So we're working with 75 cities across more than 20 states in the country to help them figure out how to make that transition and then what kind of impacts they should expect from different strategies that they pursue, whether that's around like public health impacts, economic development impacts, policy design advice, all of those kinds of things. So it's a pretty heavy data space that we're in where we're collecting tons of information and trying to figure out how to best present that and to make projections into the future around that. So Greenlink has been active in that area for the last 6 years. Prior to that, I was the City of Atlanta's first energy manager and helped really push the city forward in terms of moving from not really ranked for energy policy to being about 4th in the country by the time I left the office. And then before that, I did my PhD in climate and energy policy at Georgia Tech, where I created the first comprehensive set of carbon and energy footprints for the 100 largest cities in the U.S. and looked at those over a decade-long window and helped figure out why they were what they were, what the drivers were, as well as which strategies over that decade had led to progress, had been more successful policy approaches. So we're definitely a policy shop, but we kind of break into different segments that's between, our analyst team or our equity teams or data science teams that all kind of have their piece of the pie.
Awesome. Yeah, that's a great intro, and I have always thought what you all do is super interesting. And I know that on your website, the header is "Data for Good," which I really like because it's a complex range of topics you all address, and that's a good succinct way to kind of frame it in my mind. And I know you all have had a really big impact in what you do. on the website. Again, I was kind of revisiting it before this call. You all even are able to reference lives saved through your work, which is super powerful. So, I'd love to kind of have you expand a little bit on, how you all view your impact, like what kind of metrics you're tracking. And then if you can expand a little on just like the type of equity and energy related issues you all look to tackle, because, again, that's a big arena in a good way. There's a lot of opportunity and a lot of good to be done to help people and, improve our communities. But for a lot of us who don't have your expertise, we don't necessarily know all the layers of the onion there,
Yeah. I mean, I think looking at all the different ways that you can try to do good is an interesting way to spin what's normally cast through negative terms, whether it's on things like climate change or equity. There's always kind of two pieces to that. Like, there's the opportunity to do it better is kind of always there at the same time. And so for a lot of the work that we do, continuing kind of baseline business as usual is kind of the worst possible outcome, and everything that we're going to recommend and look at is an improvement over that.
Right.
The metrics that we track on a regular basis are our impact on CO2 emissions. So right now we're slightly over 3.5 billion tons of CO2 avoided through our work, which is huge. I mean, that's coming up on national level emissions reductions. And then we're also, we track the dollars saved from that, which is now over about 400 billion from the research and the work that we've done. And then also, as you mentioned, lives saved. And so we don't always get projects where it's easy or amenable to include the lives saved metric, but for the ones where we can track that, that's now also over 1,000 lives saved. And so we try to keep regular progress and tracking on how we're doing with our projects and how they contribute to those targets. On the energy and the equity stuff that we tend to focus on the energy side, it's a lot of energy systems. So like you have to have a systems thinking approach to this, or you're not going to understand what's happening, because everything is changing on like an hour by hour basis with our energy systems. I mean, the recent disaster in Texas is a great example where you had, kind of cascading failures of, what was happening with gas plants or coal plants or renewables, and, what kind of interconnections Texas had to other parts of the country. All of those kind of played their role at a different time that all, in that case, kind of had cascading failure that led to the problems that they experienced. But you have to have that kind of perspective on what's happening at any moment, and not just for power, but you need that for transportation. What's happening at 6 in the evening is totally different than what's happening at 6 in the morning in most cities, right? So if we want to have like good, high quality measures, that kind of temporal, geographic aspect, like all of that stuff has to be brought to the table. And when it's not, you find very large errors and mistakes in the estimates that come down. Like you'll see, it's not uncommon to see errors that are 30% or greater just because somebody takes a little bit of a shortcut on that front. On equity, we do a lot of work. Energy equity is kind of our bread and butter for that. So it's a lot of work on what's called energy burden, which is the percent of household income that's spent on utility bills. So nationally, the average is about 3%. It kind of goes between 3 and 4% depending on the year and the state of the economy. Households are considered in high energy burden if they spend more than 6%, or severe energy burden if they spend more than 10% of their income on utility bills. And that's a concern, not just because it shows disparities, but there's obviously a financial stress of spending higher and higher levels of your income on your energy bills, but it's also connected to a lot of other problems. You see connections where households that are highly energy burdened are much more likely to skip meals or to not get prescriptions filled in order to pay the utility bills. The number one reason that people use payday lenders across the United States is to pay a utility bill. And if you were already low income and then find yourself using a payday lender to pay a utility bill, it's not difficult to see what we've now found statistically true, that there is a significant correlation between evictions and energy burden. You can kind of start to see how those cycles of poverty build on each other and create negative outcomes across the country. Now, we started to take that to very high resolution looks. Instead of just talking about what's happening nationally, we actually bring it down to a neighborhood level and help cities and states figure out what's happening with these equity issues. And since things are so connected, our primary area of expertise is the energy burden areas, but there's also connections to healthcare. There's connections to racial equity issues, housing problems, and so a lot of the stuff that we end up doing is actually mapping those correlations and trying to bring in people that can help work across multiple issues. It requires a team approach, really.
Yeah. That's a great explanation, and it's really interesting stuff. I mean, I think one of the things I've enjoyed about working with you and your team, although, my level of expertise is still a drop in the bucket compared to you all, but just getting a sense of the types of data sets you all work with, some of which are really intuitive, it might be income level, but some are things that I wouldn't necessarily have thought of as interrelated in some capacity, right? But as you said, I think just getting to know you all has helped me kind of grasp the cascading effects, as you said, and how interconnected all of these things are. And, of course, I think in a very good way, progressively, a lot of these things are kind of coming more to the forefront of the public consciousness. And certainly, I think personally, one of my biggest sentiments with COVID in the last year is just how connected everyone is, right? It's all very important work and resonates with me and our team a lot, I know. So to make a little bit of a segue, I know that historically, Greenlink Analytics has been more consulting oriented, services based, if you will. But one of the main reasons that I wanted to bring you on the show, of course, is you all have launched a digital product, the Greenlink Equity Map, which I know we all affectionately call GEM. And I think that was almost 7 or 8 months ago that it went live, I think. Yeah, tell us a little bit more about the product itself and what you all are up to on that front.
Yeah, so GEM is really exciting for us. It's a software platform that we are using with more than 50 cities and have now recently just opened the door for hundreds of community-based organizations to access all over the country to be able to take a look at their specific geographies and be able to explore the data that's impacting their communities. It's data on their communities that they can. We propose that this is going to work as a way to do joint meaning making between government, so like city staff, local county agencies, whomever, and community to come in and have a shared basis of facts, so that it's not just like one group coming in to say, we felt like this has been a problem for a while, because most governments don't react to anecdote. They're not going to make policy off of anecdote, or if they feel like it's anecdotal. And so a lot of the times the data is being used to actually show that it's not just anecdotal. Here's what's actually happening on the ground in these communities. And now that we've got that shared data basis, we can start to discuss the policies that we want to pursue that are going to improve the situation. So that's been really powerful and one of the first waves of activity that's happening within GEM. But GEM allows us to take a look at 25 different equity indicators at a neighborhood level anywhere in the United States, so across all 73,000 census tracts that we can drill down to. We can search for anything based, any way that you can search for something in Google, you can search for it in GEM. So you can look at zip codes, you can look at neighborhood names. We can go to specific cities, of course, and just start to see like what is the state of play. What's our current condition look like, and then now we're expanding that also to start to look at many years worth of data, so we can see how things have been changing over time. So you can better tell the story of why and how did we end up where we are. Are things changing in the direction that we want to see them go? And if so, what's driving that? Or are they, not going in that direction? And also why? And, what might we do to address this? And so we're seeing really great immediate impacts on just engagement strategies that both community-based organizations and cities are using to talk with each other. Because simply having this information is something they've never had access to before. And so once they can actually explore that, there's a lot more work happening to go, oh, well, here's where the actual equity issues are. We're going to focus more of our resources there in those communities, as opposed to having a little bit more of like an equality mindset, which was more where they were starting from. If we've got this kind of a problem, we'll hold 8 meetings, let's break the city into quadrants and just put 2 in every quadrant, which is how a lot of stuff would have gone forward in the past. So this has been kind of great just to see that change in process. But now it's translating, and like you mentioned, it's only been 6 months since it went live. But we're seeing new policies and programs being stood up in these cities already, where they're taking the information and developing new offerings based on what they can see. And this is, again, it's like the first time that they've actually had the ability to do that. And so it's helping to break down silos inside of City Hall and across the nonprofit sectors in these cities, where you've now got an office of housing, an office of public health, the sustainability office, and the planning offices, like all coming together to pool resources, because you can see very clearly in the platform how these multiple indicators overlap on each other, and can start to identify, many of these communities are struggling with 4, 5, 6, 7 equity issues simultaneously. And so if we've only got, one office with the resources of that one office trying to address it, we're probably not doing the work that needs to be done. And we're not going to be as efficient as we could be. We could make things better, faster in these communities if we had the right people at the table with the right kinds of resources. And so I think that's a lot that's going on, but it's a really exciting spot to be helping to make that kind of change happen and seeing that occur all over the country.
Yeah, for sure. And it's a very powerful product. And what I know, of course, and you alluded to, is I think you all are just the beginning, right? Which is how things should work. You've launched a really powerful, really impactful product. You're learning a lot from the rapid adoption and the users and their, additional needs and wants. And I know there's a big vision for, as you mentioned, kind of getting more historical data represented and other things that I know are in the pipeline that's going to just that much more broaden the impact. Yeah, it's really cool. And for us, a lot of the fun of it and working with you all as the data experts is that problem or fun challenge of how to visualize this data in a way that is, relatively easy to understand across these different user types. As you mentioned, if it's within a government, you need, these different departments to be able to come together, comprehend this, have the same takeaways, and then focus on what the action is to make an impact. So I think that, data visualization in the public health space is super interesting, and particularly overlaying data sets is a fun, user interface challenge. But I think it's all come together in a really cool way. So taking a step back, I guess one question I had is, leading up to you all deciding you are going to move forward in building this platform, I assume that wasn't just a light bulb idea the day before. This must have been in the works for a while. What was that evolution like, where you started identifying there was a need for this product, and what did it take for you to kind of get to that point where you all were ready to pursue it as a team?
Yeah, so for us, it really all goes back to when we were brought on as the lead consultants for the Clean Energy Atlanta plan, which was Atlanta's 100% clean energy transition. So they had set a policy, city council in Atlanta had set a policy that by 2035, the entirety of the city would be running on 100% clean electricity. And then they tasked us with figuring out how to do that. And so one of the things that we made out of that was the first energy burden map of the city of Atlanta. And you just saw this dramatic difference between north and south, and also by race, like, the white areas. Well, now this is like really obvious in GEM, but when you map this, there's no area in Atlanta that's in the top third of being, predominantly white neighborhoods and being in the top third energy burden. There's no neighborhoods that's true for. They're all predominantly black neighborhoods in the city. And so that became obvious in the geography that you were seeing, that, the south side of the city, which is the predominantly black side of the city, was also the area that was predominantly struggling with higher energy costs. And so we created that first map, and that changed part of the process for developing the plan. But that moved us to a spot where we started to think we probably are going to see more use for this than just Atlanta. And so we started a process of developing these maps in Tableau. I mean, we went through a data process that allowed us to collect the information across the country instead of needing to get it each time through a specific request from utilities, which was its own kind of process. And then we started to develop these maps in Tableau. But Tableau was a bit difficult to work with for us. Eventually, you start to process so much data that Tableau will seize up, or it will refresh in the middle of a presentation. You have to sit there and wait. If you don't have a great internet connection, it becomes another, whole ordeal around that process. We started down a path and went to one of the foundations who act similarly to project-specific venture capital in our space to say, we think this is something that's worth pursuing. We partnered with the Urban Sustainability Directors Network to put a survey out to the sustainability directors across North America to say, do you have an issue with accessing equity data? Is this something that you guys are struggling with? And we got a response back that more than 120 sustainability directors said yes. We want to work on this. We don't have the data that would allow us to do that. And so when we presented that back up to the foundations, the Kresge Foundation came in and funded us to develop that first round of GEM. The only thing we were really on the hook for, we could have just made, several dozen of those Tableau maps and met the requirement. But my vision for where we wanted to go was, let's move out of Tableau. Let's stand up a separate software product that's going to be able to meet this need in a much more substantial way and allow us to scale and iterate and do all of the wonderful things we can do with a separate software product, as opposed to having 50 snapshots that are kind of locked in that moment in time. So yeah, we moved in that direction. It was an ambitious choice for us to go forward with, but it's worked out. It was definitely the right move for us.
Yeah, that's awesome. I love that story because so many folks dream of kind of doing a startup, right? And that's great. We love that. That's what we kind of thrive on in a lot of ways is people looking to innovate. But, there's always kind of a misconception that it's just a bright idea that comes out of nowhere and then you're just jumping in with both feet. Like, I think we really enjoy working on products like GEM, where you all have extensive experience in that space. You understand all the ins and outs. Over time, you've identified this pain point partially through your own efforts, to gather this data and present it in a compelling way. And then a lot of the kind of initial discovery work and user research, a lot of that's already kind of wrapped up in the work you've already done. You mentioned the surveys you do. And that way, of course, you're just coming in a much better position to succeed and launch something that's adopted, which obviously is how it's played out with GEM. So it's I think, a good illustration of a good way to go about that process of taking a leap and building something new, you know?
Yeah, we've interviewed at this point, several hundred sustainability professionals, businesses, community-based organizations, really kind of to just understand what is it that they needed to see how things were working for them right now. And obviously that's an ongoing process. I mean, it doesn't really stop. We go through periods where it's, heavier or lighter for us, but
right.
It's a continuous process of just making sure that we're understanding what's working, what's not, what could be better. And then also made it so that when, we partnered with you all to do that first build, we interviewed about 100 people just to inform what that would look like, so that we could come in to say, these are the problems, this is how we think it should be solved. This is, here's some mock-ups that we took to people. This is what the feedback that they got to us. So it was definitely not to jump in with your eyes closed. I mean, I think we tried to take a scientific approach to, these are our hypotheses about how the thing needs to be structured. And this is the support we've gotten back from our interviews, we call it our listening tours, from our listening tours. This is what we've learned. Yeah.
I think it's all about validating or disproving your assumptions about what people want or how they'll behave. And I agree. I think in all of our experience with you all come about it from a very scientific perspective, which actually is a good segue, because you all, of course, the team primarily comprised of, very data-oriented data scientists, very smart folks, PhDs, used to, doing all kinds of magic with these big data sets. So in a lot of ways, of course, I would consider your team very technical and very savvy, but obviously in a way that is really relevant to the work you all do. So my question is, launching a new software as a service product is a pretty big undertaking. How prepared do you think you all were for building out a web-based application? How much did you know about custom software design and development coming into this?
Oh gosh, none. We knew that was where we wanted to head, and we spoke with several companies that did that so that we could figure out ballpark how much money it was going to take and what kind of adoption it was going to require from us to make this a good decision for us as an organization. But as far as nuts and bolts, I don't know how to do anything with SQL or creating some of the back-end databases. I just knew how to sign up to do some of enable some other folks to figure that out. So no, the partnerships were critical to being able to stand any of that stuff up. As you said, we were behind the scenes kind of crunching the numbers that would go into the database, but we're not experts on how to set up cloud databases or how to create any of the structures on just even the basic login features. It's I don't know how to do that. What service do you use for that? And so we'd go ask you guys, oh, okay, well, yeah, we're going to, AWS has X, Y, and Z different things, and we're going to plug those in. And I'm just going, great.
Yep, I totally get it. So throughout kind of the build process, and again, I think even in a perfect world, building a product from scratch, there's always hiccups. There's things that, have to be reassessed along the way. What was the hardest part in your mind? What was kind of the biggest lesson learned through that process?
I think the most challenging thing for us was figuring out how to layer multiple equity indicators. It was one thing that had never been done before in all of our prior work. If we wanted to see how two indicators were related to each other, you just built two separate maps and tried to stick them real close to each other.
Right.
so that you could try to zoom in and be okay, this neighborhood kind of looks like this, and here's that one. And so the ability to actually do the overlays was going to be a whole new feature, and especially the ability to then see across the distribution, not just, here's one on top of the other, but be able to do some comparisons to say what's going on in the areas of most concern, because that's really where people are going to try to focus their efforts. Those were whole new problems to solve. So while they don't feel like they're the most technical things that we had to work through, getting the user interface and the user experience piece right, we had literally a month-long ongoing argument about colors to be used as a part of this. And we were going back, like I said, we were using our listening tour to bounce those ideas off of our users, or who we hoped would become users, around, if it's this color, what's that indicating to you? How is this going to be set up? That was a long, detailed process that in total probably took close to 2.5 months to get right. The entire build cycle, it was almost half of the build cycle. That was one problem that was trying to be solved consistently.
Yeah, for sure. And I remember before we even kicked off with you all, like understanding, and we had discussed this, of course, but just kind of intuitively understanding that was kind of the big question mark that we were going to have to figure out with you all. And because, yeah, it sounds kind of simple in a sense to overlay 2 data sets and glean meaning from that. But yeah, there's a lot there that, had to be figured out, which again is a fun problem to solve. And I think that, to your point, a lot of folks, when they're pursuing a new product, they don't give adequate weight to user experience and how crucial that is for, really getting a product that's great that folks will adopt and use and, really get value out of. And particularly with GEM, it's a very visual experience dealing with a lot of complexity that you're trying to present in a concise, way that someone can pull quickly and get aligned on what the takeaways are. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense that looking back, you would view that as kind of the biggest challenge to work through. Great. That's all really good feedback. So since you all launched the product, what's it been like balancing, GEM with your other responsibilities at Greenlink? Because now you still have, obviously, your consulting and all the expertise there in-house, but you're also becoming, in a lot of ways, a product company. So what's that kind of duality been like?
Yeah, I'd say it's a challenge. So we have our different teams and they have different projects that they're working on. GEM became its own created team as a result of this. And so I think that's been helpful, just to have, there's really only kind of one person who spends almost all of her time leading our GEM work. And then everybody else cycles on for different parts or has a different role to play. So we're about a 10-person team. So half of the team spends some time on GEM every week. But the balance between, what the analysts are doing and trying to help push specific requests forward, 90% of their time probably is not spent on GEM, but we do pull them in to help take a look at specific questions that have come up. And probably one of the nicer parts is that it can reinforce the consulting work, where cities will take a look at what's happening and then ask us to evaluate specific things for them. Because the city staff don't always have the time or the expertise to start to tease out those kinds of questions. It's a challenge. We're building more capacity to go towards GEM as its own separate operation, and hoping to just continue to see it scale, see that adoption curve continue to go, up and to the right.
Yeah. And I know that your team is growing a lot, always a great sign. So I'm really, really happy for you all. One question I had, innovating in the nonprofit space, I feel like, it's a whole different terrain. You've obviously got grants you're pursuing, very different than doing, a for-profit technology startup. Like what's that been like to you? What are the challenges associated with, trying to secure grants and move quickly in the nonprofit space?
I think that's one spot where our background and history, having been a for-profit startup, has been really helpful for us, because we still bring that mindset to it. So having some of the scrappiness, the sprint kind of nature towards a lot of things has been a helpful way to keep our heads on in terms of project management and workflows. And then kind of like I mentioned earlier, we view the grants, the foundations, essentially as investors, but they're only coming on board for one specific project. So instead of being a venture capitalist or an angel or whomever who's come in to help fund the entire thing that you're doing, we're pretty regularly working on 20 plus projects at a time on our team. And we've got a foundation that's come in to fund one of those. And so you have to treat them like they're a partner, but they're only a partner on 5% of your work stream.
Right.
Which is different. But there's also some real benefits of being able to scale or to get some of those resources in the door as you start to have success, which does look a lot like what happens with the funding round. Like you land some successes and you might start to see things start rolling your direction. That kind of work happens too, especially as people start to see more of the success that the technologies and the methods that you're applying, how that's benefiting the areas that they're concerned with. The biggest difference is that they're not chasing an exit.
Right.
So
right.
It's trying to push forward the project that you have. And I think a lot of the concern or the major difference too is that the product itself, many nonprofits stand those up and then push them out as the completion of one project. It's not viewed as an ongoing effort for, in perpetuity, which is not how we're approaching that. And it's not how we regularly approach any of the technologies that we work on. We're looking at these as long-term things that are going to be able to provide value consistently. So it's not just one grant funding one deliverable. These are building upon one another. And so in some ways that starts to look a bit like also our experiences from, way back with academia, that there's a research agenda. But for us, instead of having it be a research agenda that you get funds to build on and to build towards, we are more in an application agenda. We're trying to help certain change come into being across the country that can, work on climate change, that can work on equity, that can work on healing our democracy and making it so that our processes are better processes in total. And it's just figuring out, like, how do we do that? Where are we now? And how do we continue to make that push forward or continue to innovate on our side to drive that? But we've definitely cultivated a culture that definitely is looking for, what's the best way to go about this, which is where a lot of our data science team, lives and breathes, is, we're exploring all of these new neural network architectures, and we're bringing those to the data and seeing if that did better, and how do we roll that into the different pieces that we're already sharing with our users. So it's different, but a lot of the lessons, I think, carry over in a way that's been really helpful for us, and then serves as a differentiator for us in the way that we think about innovation and product development in total.
Yeah, very cool. And I know certainly from our initial discovery work with you and ongoing conversations, there's a big vision for GEM. I think that in a very good way, you all are kind of at the tip of the iceberg in terms of all the neat things that you think you can kind of expand upon with additional data and functionality under the platform. And, we tell people a lot. We might have told you when we first considered working together, software is never done. So it's like you kind of have to embrace that attitude. And, hopefully that means also that you're adding functionality, it's growing, you're adapting to feedback. But it also is just the reality of stuff that's web-based. It's in a very dynamic environment. So there's always work that goes into kind of supporting it and make sure everything's running smoothly. And so, yeah, of course, I totally understand trying to get others in that space to kind of understand this is an ongoing investment with a increasing impact over time. I kind of started to mention this earlier in the conversation. I think that recently, especially, but over the last few years, I think equity issues have been coming more to the forefront of kind of the public consciousness. Certainly with COVID, I think that's amplified that in kind of your average person's mindset here in the US. And so I think you all's work is just that much more important, day by day here. So I guess taking a bigger picture look, like it's a big question, but how do you think, the kind of equity space is evolving? What role do you think technology will play, in nonprofits that are trying to tackle some of these issues that you all are focused on? Are there any kind of major trends or thoughts you have there about where this is all going?
Yeah, I think it's a merger between what a lot of those community-based organizations have been saying and trying to do for decades, matching up with things like what we're able to prove out now with data, and a supportive political environment, especially in a lot of our cities, that's really going to make it so that the change can happen. I mean, we're looking at changes, as I mentioned, immediately as far as process equity goes, and making sure that you actually have community represented at the table, that they're not being planned for, they're being planned with, is just a real change to the way that policy has traditionally been made in this country. And so that's like the first thing that you see come along. Then you start to work on kind of distributional equity and starting to see, who's dealing with higher levels of all kinds of burdens. So it's not just the energy burden stuff, but who's got high housing burdens, who's paying a lot for their transportation. A lot of the stuff like in COVID, one of the things that our cities have been focusing on has been, what's the overlap between communities that don't have access to broadband and also don't have access to healthcare. Like if we're trying to have, and that's something GEM shows them, but it's not anything that's like in our wheelhouse necessarily. So it's been a lot of interesting work to try to bring together people who do know that, who are the healthcare equivalents of Greenlink, to get them in the room to start to help advance that conversation. But seeing how those distributional inequities really play out across communities, so that you can start to recognize, where the racial disparities are, where the wealth disparities are, where the health outcome disparities are, and start to design things to work on that. And then kind of the last thing that's the long-term big picture is kind of institutional, intergenerational equity issues that are going to be things more like climate change, but also just infrastructure and how things are built across communities that are going to last for 30, 50, 100 years. What kind of investments and what kind of attention needs to be paid in order to make sure that that's being done in a way that's fair to everybody, which also historically not really a big consideration when you look at things like redlining or the way that the interstate highway systems were developed. Like they did things. It was not really with the input of community, or sometimes, in many times, intentionally exclusionary, that have created, issues that we're still dealing with now. So all of that's been really great to start to see progress on, and I think it's also in a spot now where accountability is starting to come back also. So there's, communities or politicians that had made pledges that said they wanted to work in a specific way and maybe have gotten a pass for a year, are now starting to feel some pressure for not necessarily living up to what those pledges were, which I think it's necessary. Like if we're going to actually see the change, then those leaders have to be held accountable for the statements and the commitments that they made.
Yeah, for sure. It's very interesting. And I think that, you all live in a world with a lot of complexity in terms of the different parties that have to come together to really take action on like this data or these insights that are being provided. And to your point, I hope that we're coming into a really good time where there's enough alignment that people can really run with this stuff and we can see change. And, one thing that I think is really cool about public health in general, and I think GEM does this in a very sophisticated way, and there's a lot more coming there, I know, but in a lot of instances, it's just getting data in front of people so that everyone's looking at the same thing, and so that, people can make informed decisions and be educated. And that's what I think is really neat, is it doesn't always have to be some AI innovation with virtual reality. Sometimes it's just people need data. They need to know what's going on, that needs to inform decisions. Let's get everyone aligned on what's happening here. And so I think that's really neat. And I think what you all are doing is super important. Thrilled to get a chance to play a small part in supporting what you're doing. And really appreciate you being on the show. So looks like we're about out of time. But this has been great. You've given a lot of great insights and really appreciate your time. So before we sign off, Matt, where can listeners go to connect with you or learn more about Greenlink Analytics or Jim specifically?
Yeah, so you can find me on LinkedIn. So do you search for Matt Cox and Greenlink, I'll come up there. You can find more about Greenlink Analytics at www.greenlinkanalytics.org. And GEM has its own standalone webpage that's www.equitymap.org.
Awesome. Definitely encourage folks to check that stuff out. And thanks again, Matt. We really appreciate it. It's been great having you on the Digital Footprint.
No, thanks so much for the invitation.
All right.
Thank you for listening to the Digital Footprint. This show is brought to you by Tyrannosaurus Tech, an award-winning technology partner dedicated to designing and developing high-impact software products. If you like what you heard in this episode, make sure to subscribe to the podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. For show notes and access to all episodes, please visit tyrannosaurustech.com/blog. Digital Footprint.